Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Wednesday, April 14th, 2021. And on this episode, I'm going to go through some of the highlights of James Madison's arguments against the constitutionality of a national bank, the Bank Bill of 1791, but it really applies to our message of ending the Fed today as well. Now, he opposed it primarily on grounds of delegated and reserve power, saying, look, this power is not expressly delegated, and so therefore you can't incorporate this bank. But he also rejected claims on this that used the general welfare clause, the necessary and proper clause, and a bunch of others, like the power to borrow money was a big one, and even the preamble to the Constitution. And then after all of that, and before it was signed into law, he was actually asked by George Washington himself, president at the time, to draft a veto message. So he drafted a couple of options of veto messages in case that the president decided to reject the bill. And I think that's a very interesting piece of this, and I'll share that with you at the end of the episode. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is everything you need to follow this program, all the archives for closing in on 3 years. On individual episodes like this one, I will link to a bunch of original source, a handful of original source documents, so you can read what I'm talking about in context and learn more on your own time. It's really great stuff, and I try to make it as easy as possible for you to find the information, and I'm working on improving our site a little bit more over time. The homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. There you'll also find our membership program, where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. We make it go a long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. You can also find all the different platforms we're on. We live stream on the mainstream ones like Facebook and YouTube and Twitch and Twitter, but we are also on DLive and hopefully Odyssey.com soon. I just got to reach out to them and get that set up so we can live stream on a decentralized, censorship-resistant platform. We also upload the archives, oftentimes to MeWe, but they have file size limits that I got to figure out how to get past. We upload to Minds and Gab and Brighteon and BitChute and BitTube, and we have the podcast edition on Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon, and everywhere else you can find it. Again, the show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while we allow people another moment or so to get notifications on those mainstream platforms and join us here in the live stream, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. Good to see you, Justin Bayola, first over there on YouTube. Rachel Menard, Erwin Havernick, Tyler B., Bob Landry, Dixie Strong, Clay Kent, Blue North Wind, always good to see you in Southeast Texas, Grady Jenkins, MRGF, Todd Rose has a great comment over on Facebook. How would you even trust the government to run a bank? In fact, I think we could just put a blank after the word run a blank, anything. Alan Hughes and everyone else. Dan Reed, good to see you, buddy. Dan had reached out to me for his Culinary Libertarian podcast to ask about doing an episode on secession yesterday, and I recommended Brian McClanahan. I don't know if you guys, especially those of you who are on YouTube, are subscribing to other platform channels and things like that. Brian does great stuff. He's often very supportive of our work here as well, and we're supportive of him as well. So hopefully they'll get that worked out, and we'll be able to talk about that episode a little bit more in the future. Anyways, let's get right to this. And I appreciate everyone being here, and I apologize if I missed anybody. But let's start out. This is really kind of a follow-up episode. I did one last October 2nd, 2020. Thomas Jefferson, the Constitution versus the National Bank. For those of you who are in the End the Fed community, which should be everyone at this point, even if you're not on board with everything else, if you're on the left, the right, and the middle, the Federal Reserve is the engine that powers all the garbage that you hate. So we should all be on the End the Fed. Unfortunately, we're not, but those of us who are kind of aware of the arguments, generally when you go back to the founding, we think of the debate being between Hamilton and Jefferson. And Jefferson famously issued his opinion on the constitutionality of the national bank February 15th, 1791, just 10 months to the day before the Bill of Rights was ratified. And his primary opposition, he literally put the 10th Amendment, which was still under consideration, or his paraphrase of it, as the number one reason. Like, look, the powers not delegated are reserved to the states or to the people, so you don't have this delegated powers. But he also said he took on claims about the Commerce Clause, the General Welfare Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause. But even before before. So I will link to this episode in the show notes. That one's only about 14, 15 minutes because I just kind of powered through the main arguments that Jefferson made. And it's very powerful stuff. So I will link to that so you can check it out on your own time or look at it as kind of like a precursor to this episode or a follow-up to this one as well. But even before Jefferson issued that opinion on February 15th, James Madison had two pretty major speeches against the bank bill of that year, talking about the constitutionality of it and, of course, some of the logistical and policy issues that go along with it. On February, I believe, 2nd and February 2nd and February 8th. So in the 2 weeks prior to Jefferson's opinion, Madison had already summed up quite a bit. And I want to get to the highlights of that and first point out that when he started out his speech on February 2nd, his first speech on this, he started out with some general economic discussions, talking about the advantages and disadvantages of banks in general. He talked about fiat and paper money versus hard money. And he even cited Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. But then he went on to the constitutional objections. And he started out with this. And this is not really the exact words. This is basically the notes of Madison's speech. So you can't really find, the way it was published, it'll say things like, he had entertained this opinion, blah, blah, blah. So he pointed out right at the beginning of the constitutional arguments, and he's really talking about delegated and reserved powers. He's talking about the fact that the notion of having a power to issue charters of incorporation was considered in the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. Someone proposed that the federal government should have the power to just have a general power to issue charters of incorporation. They considered it, they voted on it, and they said no. And so James Madison is saying, like, look, we talked about this in Philadelphia. It didn't even make it into the final document. It was proposed. He didn't even mention it, but it was James Madison himself. And this is an interesting part of James Madison's character. And if you are familiar with his last act in office, where he vetoed an infrastructure spending bill, which he supported as a policy, he wanted the federal government to do this type of infrastructure spending, and he could easily have signed it on his last day in office and not had any problem with it. But he still vetoed it anyways because he thought it was something that was not delegated to the federal government in the Constitution. That's not something you see very often. And Madison, like every other politician in history, every other human being in history, had very serious flaws as a human being. But when it came to this adherence to the Constitution, he was pretty consistent. Even where he opposed or supported things, he would oppose them on constitutional grounds. Like, look, I want to do this, but we need to have an amendment to authorize the federal government to do this kind of general infrastructure spending on all kinds of bridges and roads and canals. I can see the reason to do it, but we got to get rid of this. Can't do it. No way. Veto. So he did that. But then he's also talking about a power to issue charters of incorporation. This is something that he himself offered in the Philadelphia Convention. He actually proposed it. He thought the Fed should have that power. They rejected it. And now he's saying, like, look, we tried this. I mean, he should have just said, I think he just should have said, and maybe he did, and it just didn't make it in the notes. Like, look, this was my idea, and you guys said no. And so it's not in the Constitution. It wasn't considered by the ratification conventions. The people didn't even have the opportunity. They weren't voting to ratify. They weren't supporting ratification of something in a document with this in it, because it's not there. And so here from the notes on the speech, he says his impression might perhaps be stronger because he well recollected that a power to grant charters of incorporation had been proposed in the General Convention and rejected. And so it goes on. Is the power of establishing an incorporated bank among the powers vested by the Constitution and the legislature of the United States? This is the question to be examined. And again, while the 10th Amendment had not even been ratified, this was under consideration. It was ratified along with the rest of the Bill of Rights in December of that year, and Jefferson made his foundation of his opinion on this. In fact, he talked about the federal government, the powers of the Constitution, the delegation of powers of the Constitution. The foundation of that was laid on the grounds of the text of the 10th Amendment. And that's really what Madison is talking about here just a couple weeks earlier as well. He's talking about the structure of the Constitution. He says it's not a general grant of power. It's not a general grant that they can just do whatever. It's not a general grant out of which particular powers are accepted. You don't have the power to do anything and everything, and then we just list stuff that you can't do. No, he says it's a grant of particular powers only, leaving the general mass in other hands, reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This is a 10th Amendment argument before the 10th Amendment actually became part of the Constitution for the United States. He says, so it has been understood by its friends and its foes. So everyone understood through the ratification that this is what it was supposed to be. And he says, and so it was to be interpreted. Again, 10th Amendment argument through and through. So he's saying, like, look, you don't have the power to do this. It has not been expressly delegated. So if you think you can actually do this anyway, you have to find the power elsewhere. And people have already been making these arguments. So he says, reviewing the Constitution with an eye to these positions, it was not possible to discover in it the power to incorporate a bank. It just doesn't say that. That's the first thing you do. When you're looking to see if something that the federal government is doing or wants to do is constitutional or not, the first thing you do is you read the text. And if you can't find the exact thing in there or the power to do it spelled out, then that's option number one. Then, if not, you have to look to some of the other delegated powers. And he says, it was not possible to discover this power. The only clauses under which such a power could be pretended, and I love that he doesn't say could be authorized, he says pretended. So we know his opinion on this right off the bat, and it's in the Fed and the National Bank. He says, 1, the power to lay and collect taxes, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare. That's the General Welfare Clause. Also, the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. That's number 2 that he's going to address in this speech of February 2nd, 1791. And number 3, of course, the power to pass all laws necessary and proper to carry into execution all the other powers delegated in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Let me talk a little bit about some of these each. The first one he talks about is general welfare. He says the bill did not come within the first power, the bank bill. It laid no tax to pay the debts or provide for the general welfare. It was not a tax to do that. It laid no tax whatever. It was altogether foreign to the subject. He goes on, no argument could be drawn from the terms common defense and general welfare. The power as to these general purposes was limited to acts laying taxes for them. And that is the kind of the one sentence or one paragraph overview of what the General Welfare Clause is all about. Of course, a lot of people today, supporters of the monster state, want you to believe that the General Welfare Clause means they have the power to do anything that they determine is in the best interests of whoever they decide needs welfare. That's how it's treated today. In most situations, it's so broad, it's almost an unlimited power the way they use it and the way that the courts interpret it. But Madison himself specifically said, look, the power of general welfare was, quote, limited to acts laying taxes for them. And then the general purposes, what does that mean? They themselves were limited and explained by the particular enumeration subjoint. So it was, you can lay taxes for these general things. And then they listed all the other delegated powers in Article 1, Section 8. Now, that isn't a complete list of all the delegated powers, but those were the ones that the General Welfare Clause applied to. He goes on, he says, to understand these terms in any sense that would justify the power in question, that is, to create a national bank, would give to Congress an unlimited power. So in order to twist and shove this bank bill into the General Welfare Clause is in essence giving them unlimited power under that clause. And that's really what we live under today. And it really started at least in 1791, if not sooner. He says it would render nugatory the enumeration of particular powers. What's the point of even listing these particular powers in relationship to the General Welfare Clause if you're just going to do whatever you want anyways? And he said it would supersede all the powers reserved to the state governments. Then we can go on to the power to borrow money. He says, is this a bill to borrow money? It does not borrow a shilling. Is there any fair construction by which the bill can be deemed an exercise of the power to borrow money? The obvious meaning of the power to borrow money, I stumble over that, is that of accepting it from and stipulating payments to those who are able and willing to lend. To say that the power to borrow involves the power of creating the ability, blah, blah, blah. In other words, no, this is just twisting the clause again. So he rejects the notion of creating a national bank under the delegated powers of the Constitution, under the power to borrow money. And then third, he talks about necessary and proper. He says, whatever meaning this clause may have, none can be admitted that would give an unlimited discretion to Congress. He's admitting that even though he thinks the necessary and proper clause is pretty clear, and he goes into it in some detail. I'm just going to go through some highlights here. Even though he's got a strong understanding of this clause, he recognizes that other people have other views of it. And he starts out by saying, like, look, no matter what view anybody has, you can't say they have unlimited discretion in Congress. It's still necessary and proper means something. Those words don't mean anything and everything or whatever the hell you want. He starts out by saying its meaning must, according to the natural and obvious force of the terms and the context, be limited to means necessary to the end and incident to the nature of the specified powers. Those of you who have heard me talk about necessary and proper, you know where we're going on this, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Incident is very important here. He says the clause is in fact merely declaratory of what would have resulted by unavoidable implication. Look, the delegated powers in and of itself, they didn't even need to add the necessary and proper clause because it was really there in the structure of the document. He says, as the appropriate, as it were, technical means of executing those powers. This is what it means to be able to exercise those powers. Necessary and proper just clarifies it, and it's actually a very important legal term of the time that most people aren't familiar with today, and we'll get to that again in just a moment. He says, in this sense, it had been explained by the Friends of the Constitution and ratified by the state conventions. He's telling us how to read the Constitution here as well. So much, a wealth of information here from Madison. He's like, look, if you want to understand what something means in the Constitution, you look to how it was explained by the people who supported it. I think we also need to look to how the opponents of it also explained how it could be misused. So you have this kind of holistic view of how it was explained to the ratifying conventions. And then how did the ratifying conventions actually accept it? Because the Constitution from the Philadelphia Convention was just words on paper. I mean, it still is words on paper, but words on paper don't enforce themselves, but they had no legal impact until the people of the several states ratified it, approved it, gave it legal force. They were the ones who gave it, well, we'll call it life of some sort. So he's explaining how to read this. And what he's really talking about, this idea of incidental powers, necessary to the end and incident to the nature of these specified powers, this is the legal doctrine of principles and incidents. I covered this in some detail in an episode almost 2 years ago, July of 2019, necessary and proper, not anything and everything. Incidental power is something that's completely different than the idea of implied power, which, of course, Hamilton absolutely loved in support of this bank bill, and now we have the Federal Reserve. And he goes on, he says, if, proceeded he, Congress by virtue of the power to borrow can create the means of lending, and in pursuance of these means can incorporate a bank, they may do anything whatever creative of like means. So that's kind of his summary. Basically, if you can just do whatever you want, you're going to have the power to basically do this for anything. He then spent quite a bit of time talking about implied powers versus incidental powers. And he gave a number of other examples of other delegated powers and what kind of qualified under those. I'm not going to get into any detail on that right now. I think you should check out this episode on necessary and proper. It's a pretty long technical legal discussion and the history behind it. And I will link to that in the show notes if you want to understand that difference, what that's all about. So Madison covered this again on necessary and proper. So we're talking general welfare, the power to borrow, and necessary and proper. That was his February 2nd speech. Then we can move on. There's all kinds of debate in the House of Representatives through the next few days. And then on February 8th, this is his summary first I want to get to before we get to February 8th. He says the power exercised by the bill was condemned. So you don't, it's not authorized. It was condemned by the silence of the Constitution. It's not been delegated. It's not there. So then we have to look elsewhere. He says it was condemned by the rule of interpretation arising out of the Constitution. It was condemned by its tendency to destroy the main characteristic of the Constitution, limited delegated powers. It was condemned by the expositions of the friends of the Constitution whilst depending before the public. So the people who explained how this was going to play out, that they said this is how it's going to be, and the people ratified it on that understanding. So if you go beyond that, as Jefferson said in the coming weeks, it is to take a boundless field of power. He goes on, it was condemned by the apparent intention of the parties which ratified the Constitution. It was condemned by the explanatory amendments proposed by Congress themselves to the Constitution, which were under consideration at that time, and he hoped it would receive its final condemnation by the vote of this House. So he argued aggressively against this, even though in the Philadelphia Convention he proposed this kind of power. Now, going forward to the next speech, February 8th, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because it isn't as long and it isn't as impactful in my view, but he starts out again with this 10th Amendment kind of principle, this principle of expressly delegated powers. And he says, the power of granting charters, he observed, is a great and important power and ought not to be exercised without we find ourselves expressly authorized to grant them. He's making the same argument. Like, look, let's look in the document. Is there a power listed to grant charters? And of course, we know from his speech days earlier, he's the guy who actually knows that they considered this previously. Not everyone in the House of Representatives at that time was in Philadelphia for those secret conversations. He goes on, he says he argued against the influence of the precedent because once you establish additional power by precedent, George Washington, who ended up signing this into law, warned us so wisely against this in 1796 in his farewell address. Maybe he was doing so because he's like, man, I created a problem. I don't know. Maybe he was just oblivious to this. Maybe he thought he wasn't establishing a precedent. I don't really know. But Madison here was also talking about establishing a precedent to expand power beyond the limits of the Constitution, maybe because people thought it was a good idea. He says, for though it has been said that the charter is to be granted only for a term of years. So some people were basically going to vote yes because they're saying like, look, there's some debate over this and we really need this and it's only going to be for a certain number of years and then we'll deal with it later on. Or maybe the courts will deal with it. In fact, Madison addressed that as well. We're going to just rely on the courts to fix this. We shouldn't just vote for this. He says, yet he contended that granting the powers on any principle is granting them in perpetuum. In other words, soon as you give them the power to do one little thing, they have that power forever. And you're just relying on the goodness of those people in the future to maybe not use that power. So that's what you really have to consider. And that's something I talk about all the time. The power that you grant someone or you're okay with somebody using today, even if you like the results right now, you're also granting that same power to people who hate you, hate your liberty, hate the Constitution, and want to do exactly the opposite. So the idea is, don't grant them the power in the first place. And Madison's making that case right here. He says, and assuming this right on the part of the government involves the assumption of every power whatever. Again, he's just making that case. And then he talks about an argument regarding the preamble. Someone actually made the case in the House of Representatives that, like, look, the preamble says we can do this. And so therefore, we can create this bank. The preamble is just kind of an unlimited grant of power. And I don't know if anyone really believed that or if they were just being political and just trying to ramrod what they wanted to get done into whatever existed. We see that happen a lot. And here's Madison talking about. He says, the preamble to the Constitution has produced a new mine of power. He's never heard of this. He says, but this is the first instance he had heard of in which the preamble had been adduced for such a purpose. He can't even imagine the preamble being used to establish a national bank. But yet, here he is having to address this, No one thought that that was the case, and he explains what the preamble was and is. He says, in his opinion, the preamble only states the objects of the Confederation. That's just the goals. The preamble is beautiful prose, and it explains what's going on, why the Constitution exists. He says, and the subsequent clauses designate the express powers by which those objects are to be obtained. It's not a grant. It's not a positive grant of new power. It's an explanation of what the document's about. And therefore, the expressly delegated powers are there to achieve those particular goals. So he's talking about the preamble as well. And then he briefly refuted a bunch of other claims. And there's more and more, and I'm not even talking about all of them. Someone talked about the power to regulate trade. We know Jefferson talked about the Commerce Clause. In his opinion, the following week, he again addressed the Necessary and Proper Clause. Someone talked about having a power to pay the interest of the public debt. But this is basically, like I was getting at, this is basically what politicians do. And I think that's what was happening at the time. If something is not expressly delegated, clearly spelled out in the delegated powers of the Constitution, and someone wants to get something done, they're just going to be like, well, let's see if we can get it to fit in this necessary and proper. Oh, well, there's general welfare. Oh, there's commerce. Borrow money, preamble. They just go through one after the next until they can make an argument that enough people accept to get their things done. And Madison is arguing against this. And this is a long tradition from the old revolutionaries to reject this type of approach. John Dickinson, the only kind of other guy I think is important enough to point out in this particular episode, along with Jefferson, he actually warned against this back in 1767 in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania against the hated Townshend Acts. These were very widely read. They were the most widely read revolutionary documents until the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in the beginning of 1776. And here's how Dickinson put it. And Madison was just merely kind of just repeating this type of a warning, or I think he was just like looking at this, like you're making the case for anything and everything, and you're establishing a precedent and twisting these legal arguments. And this is the same kind of argument that Dickinson made a few decades earlier. And here's how Dickinson put it. All artful rulers who strive to extend their power beyond its just limits endeavored to give their attempts as much semblance of legality as possible. I think, in my opinion, that's what was going on in regards to the bank bill. In my opinion, that's probably what happens all the time. You see people make it, well, a lot of people are just ignorant. They're just power-hungry monsters. But people who support the politicians, I see this happen all the time. Someone you'd think would be in support of limiting government under the Constitution, soon as their political team gets in charge, all of a sudden they're making excuses as to why there's more consolidated, centralized power that this dude can actually use to coerce the people of the several states into their own approach, because it fits their policy perspective, their policy goals. And that's what Dickinson warned about. I think that's probably what Madison was just being hammered with. Like, how are you making all these crazy cases, including the preamble, and the fact that he almost made a joke about it? It's kind of like some dark humor, pointing out, like, I've never even heard this. This is the first instance he had heard of using the preamble to establish a national bank. This is kind of nuts. Anyways, here's Madison as well in the same kind of view some years later. This is a speech in the Virginia Convention, not ratifying debates, of December 2nd, 1829. He put it this way: the essence of government is power, and power, lodged as it must be in human hands, will ever be liable to abuse. And he recognized all along that people with power would always try to exercise more power or abuse those powers. He saw it happen firsthand, certainly in 1791, trying to make the argument for a national bank under so many different parts of the Constitution. And that's the same argument that Dickinson made some years earlier. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, George Washington actually, who signed the bill into law, giving us the first national bank of the U.S. He signed it, but he specifically asked James Madison, will you draft a veto message for me? Madison also drafted his first edition of the farewell address. George Washington was going to step down in 1792 before he was convinced to stick around another 4 years. So Madison was a very close advisor, a close confidant of the president's at that time. And he was the guy that was going to do it. So here's a letter from Madison to George Washington on February 21st, 1791. No one knew how it was going to go. Maybe Hamilton did. I don't know. But Madison didn't know how it was going to go. And he says, here we go. This is what There's two options. One, if you're vetoing it on constitutionality, you've got this. I object to the bill because it is an essential principle of the government that powers not delegated by the Constitution cannot be rightfully exercised, because the power proposed by the bill to be received is not expressly delegated, and because I cannot satisfy myself that it results from any express power by fair and safe rules of implication. So that's Madison's brief explanation for George Washington to veto the national bank on grounds that it is not a power delegated to the federal government, expressly delegated in the Constitution, or cannot be found in any of the other expressly delegated powers in the Constitution. This is a 10th Amendment argument through and through. And then he had a much longer one that I'm not going to go through, but you can read. I will link to this letter to George Washington in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And that was if Washington decided to veto on the merits or in addition. So he could say, look, this is unconstitutional, or I just think it's bad policy, or he could say both. Interesting stuff. I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope you learned something. I know we generally focus, again, on Jefferson's arguments against the constitutionality of the national bank, but I think James Madison had some really powerful stuff as well. And in fact, maybe Jefferson built upon and summarized a lot of Madison's arguments. If you like this stuff, I've got another episode that I'll do at some point in the future. There's also Edmund Randolph's opinion. Randolph was one of these kind of quasi-bigger government guys, but sometimes was really kind of on the side of federalism. He certainly made the case against the constitutionality of this bank bill, but Hamilton ended up winning out against these three powerful and highly respected Virginians who all knew Washington for so long. So the whole kind of thing is pretty weird to me, especially if you consider Washington's farewell warning. Why the heck did he do this? I don't know. Other people actually may have the answer. Was it Hamilton? Did Hamilton make that powerful of a case? Did Washington ignore his own warnings some years in the future and say, well, we just need to do this. I'm not too concerned about the precedent. Let's just give them the 10 years or the short amount of time that we're going to do this, 20 years, whatever. I don't know, and that's something that I want to study. And if you know a little bit more about that, please leave it in the comments. Send me an email, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. And as well, we're talking about that stuff. If you support the show and you want to help us spread the word, you can do so with some easy peasy, free, quick actions. Smashing a like button, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, leaving comments, especially in the archive, sharing a link. All that stuff will trigger the mainstream platform's algorithms and tell that algorithm to show the program to more people. It helps out a ton. Thank you for that. And if you are able to, don't feel any obligation, but if you are able to, please consider a membership. They start out as little as $2 a month. You can find out all about that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I want to take a quick look over in the live chat before I head out. Norman Bell says, bravo, one of the best episodes. That's awesome. I think about some of this stuff and I kind of ramble through it, and I'm just there's so much information that I'm trying to distill down into anywhere from 20 minutes to 40 minutes. Sometimes I feel like I'm jumping all over the place. So I really appreciate it. Norman says, it captures most of what I've been teaching anyone that will listen for the last several years, and it backs it all up with excellent citations from primary literature. I'll share this and bring it up for years to come. Awesome, Norman. I will link to both of Madison's speeches, February 2nd, February 8th, and then that really cool letter to George Washington of February 21st. And then I also will include the link to the episode I did on Jefferson's opinion on the constitutionality of the bank, and then also the episode I did on necessary and proper. There's tons of info, and I'm glad this was helpful. Rachel Menard says, awesome job. Thank you so much. Erwin Havernick, I love your comments, dude. You always have such good stuff. The essence of 2021 governments is power grabs constantly. Yes, and we were absolutely warned about that. And I can go back to Washington's farewell warning. He said, look, what you're doing, this whole idea of just having party over principle rather than the other way around, is going to lead to a frightful despotism. And he thought a formal and permanent despotism could come out of that as well, but something that was way down the line. And I think we are way down the line today. Thomas Chase makes a good point. Sociopaths do what gets them what they want. And that, I'm assuming, is commenting on the notion that, like what Dickinson was talking about in 1767, artful rulers will just try to do whatever they can to make what they're trying to do sound legal. And of course, that's what they'll always do. And that's what they always have done. Going a little further, Herwin Havernack says, necessary and proper is so broad and could be justified for virtually any governmental action. Well, that's how it's been used for our entire lifetime. So of course it seems like that. But if we understand the legal doctrine that it was ratified under, how it was explained to the people of the several states, this legal doctrine of principles and incidents, that the incidental power, not implied power, has to be directly related to the express power, and it can't swallow up, it can't be larger than the delegated power. So, for example, the power to establish post offices. An incidental power to that is obviously to buy land to put the post office on, maybe hire a construction company. But it doesn't mean to have, I would say, a monopoly or to take over all the banking system, because if you have to, or own all real estate in the country because, oh, we're going to own some real estate to run the post office or we're going to lease it. Now we have to be a real estate company as well. Those are different types of powers. And it's kind of gray area sometimes, but I think I do a much better job explaining it where I had my notes in front of me as well in that episode from back in 2019. It's a good point though, Erwin. I appreciate that. Going a little further, let's take a quick look. Talking about all kinds of, the preamble granted no power, says Jay Armstrong. Absolutely. And that's what Madison's getting at here as well. He's basically explaining, like, look, this is what we're doing, and here's the list of stuff as to how we are accomplishing that. And that's a very important point. I know there was a Supreme Court opinion on that as well, and Jay pointed out as well. I don't know what it is. I'm not really a court watcher, so I'm pretty bad at citing court cases from time to time as well. Van Bozeman, good to see you, man. Appreciate all your feedback and your comments that you've been sharing lately. Thank you for being here. And I think I am good on the comments here. I'm definitely rambling on a little bit. I appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. If you have further thoughts on this, please continue to leave comments in the archive. I read through them and reply to as many as I can, primarily on YouTube, but sometimes on the other platforms, heavily on Gab, also on Odyssey and Library. I reply to as many as I can over there. But I read through all of them and I get a lot of great ideas for future episodes. Again, you can also email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, all spelled out. And don't forget that membership program, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, if you have the financial means to support us as well. I can't thank you enough for any consideration you can give to joining us as a member. Again, thanks for being here. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.